All right, so instead of calling in the project list API, the API call directly, what we're doing now is we're trying to get into this separate projects API TS so that we can have that one centralized call that we can just make reference to in the projects list. And I was almost done. I just realized I had some other code in here just because I want to start thinking about error handling. As we're moving through the project, we really, if we're doing it right, ought to have some error handling. So after we try fetching the project, we can do things like say, if the response is not okay. So if there was an error of some kind, then we could say, throw a new error. And we can say, failed to fetch projects. This is really helpful as we're trying to debug, of not having it be a mystery of where we're going wrong. And so, and the other thing is we're missing an import here for the project type. We need to bring in the project TS type, and just need to save there to get that out. And so now we've got some error handling in, we've got this all set up. So what we need to do is go back to our project. Let's see, so in our project list, TSX, we need to update our project list to be able to use this now. So currently, nothing here is really going to change, other than there are a couple of, we want to be able to check for errors, and so we're going to create a couple of different new variables here. So we'll have a const called error, and we can set whether there's an error or not to make decisions, and then that'll be using state. It's a string, and then we put a bar and then null, and then the default state is null. So if there's not an error, we're okay with that. It can be null, that's fine. All right, and then the other one is a const for loading, where we can set loading and use state. Our default there will be, well, it's a Boolean variable, whether we're loading or not loading, so we can control that. Okay, so then what we're going to do is in the use effects, we're going to change. I want to name this something different here. We're going to load projects, just to emphasize it's not the same thing as fetch projects. And then what I'm going to do is this code that was in there, we'll pull out, and before we go in and set the projects and set the total items and all that stuff, what we want to do is, same thing, we'll add a try and a catch. So try, and then in there we can say set loading to true, because we're in the middle of loading the project, right? And then we can say the const data that we were using before is equal to await, and then we're going to call our fetch projects. So the method that's here in the API, fetch projects, that's what we're going to call. So await fetch projects, and then we're going to pass to it the information that it needs. Remember, we defined that what we need in order to be able to do this is a page size, a page num, and selected categories. So on this end, we need to pass those things in. So I'm going to pass in here page size, page num, and selected categories. So now the fetch projects has all the information that it needs to be able to make that call. Well, then after that's done, and this stuff, actually, I can take this brace for the try. We want this all inside that. So we can have in here a catch, same thing, error, and as part of that catch, we can say set error. So we're calling our method here. We're going to tell it that there was an error, and then we can pass in to that the error that came in as error.message. Well, it's as error parenthesis dot message. There's not a parenthesis out there on the end. Okay, so we're going to set the error in our variable to whatever the error message was that's coming out of it. And then with the try catch, there's also a finally that we can do. And this finally is, even if we get an error somewhere in the try and we've caught it, we've got an error, but we still have something we need to execute. Even if there's an error, then that was what the finally is for. So we can say finally set loading equal to false to put the loading, the fact that it's loading, back to false. And we're going to use that here in a moment. So with that, we can start to do things like give a message. And then, by the way, we're going to, instead of fetch projects, we're going to call load projects because that's the new name of our method here. So I'll load projects. We've got that set up. And then what we can do now with this error handling that we've set up and these variables that we've set up with, whether we got an error, whether we're loading, we can now give messages to the user that in place of it, and you've seen this in websites you've used, we can say if we're loading. So if loading is true, return a paragraph that says loading projects. So they'll see a message and they know that it's trying to load, so it's not just blank. In the projects that we've done so far, if the data doesn't load, it's just blank there, but instead it could say loading projects. And then we can say if there's an error, then return a paragraph, and we could give it a class name of text red 500. We'll see how this looks, saying error, and then whatever the error message is, we can pass it in because we've stored it. So here we set up an error variable, here we're storing it, and now we can use it to tell the user what, and by saying user, it's actually helpful for us as the programmers to know what that error is. Okay, so we've modified this now, so it's not making the call itself. The call is happening here. We're passing it the data that it needs. It returns the information into this data variable that we use. And by the way, I thought I'd done this in one of the previous projects, but there's potential for an infinite loop here where I'm getting total items, and yet I just immediately call this. And when I call this, it's going to change total items, which is going to send it right back into a use effect. And so as I've been working through this code, looking at errors, it said, you really ought to change this to instead take this data total num projects and just put it in place right here of total items. It's the same thing, right? I'm just taking this and setting it to this and then calling it here. So I set it directly to the total number of projects that's coming through that API call, and that means I can get rid of this line of code where I'm setting total items. Well, that means that I never use total items, and so I can get rid of this line of code. It does think I'm using it somewhere else. Where do I use total items? Let's do a search. Total items. Oh yeah, just here, but I don't want to use it here. That's the point. So I can delete this line of code where I'm building the total items variable, and then I can delete this entry, and that way I don't create this little infinite loop that we potentially run into as we're trying to set the figure out how many pages we have. We need the total number of projects, but I'm getting that from the data. Okay, so we've fixed this. Is it going to work? I don't know if I have time to set it up in this video, so let's start it in the next one. We'll get it set up and make sure it's still working the way that we wanted it to. Spencer, out.